Hi everyone and welcome to this webinar. We're going to discuss the result of the Open Dialogue on AI Ethics project that took part of the International Consultation on AI Ethics issue organized by UNESCO during this summer, more specifically, or during July and August 2020. So my name is Fatima Gabriela Salazar Gomez and I'm responsible of the citizen mobilization at Mila, and I will be joined today by Vincent May, a PhD student at Mila and member of Algora Lab, and Camille Lantagne, research on AI ethics project at Algora Lab. So what is Open Dialogue on AI ethics? As I said it's participating into international consultation about AI ethics. There's 3 steps at that consultation. The first one was a survey. The second one was a sub-regional and regional consultation. And the third step, workshop, deliberation workshop and delibinar. The third step was financial and supported by government of Canada and Quebec. So they thought it was really important to consult the civil society to better understand as expert how the people understand what is AI ethics and what is AI in life. So it is important to notice that we didn't did consultation, but more deliberation, and to better understand the difference with consultation and deliberation, Vincent will explain you the methodology of that. In total, we had 37 deliberation workshop and 11 webinar in more than 54 countries. 2 of the 37 deliberation workshop had a feminist lens. The goal of this workshop was to analyze the recommendation document according to an ethic of care and to allow women to express themselves fully. Or I forget to say the workshop were non-mixed too, so only person that identify themselves as a woman could participate to that workshops. We only have 2 of those workshop in Canada. Was really because of time. If we have more time, I think we'll organize more of those workshops around the world. Most specifically, I think in South America that I saw really a big participation of women. So during the ODI pilot project, we noted a disparity in speaking time amount of women. So men could speak during a 3 hours deliberation workshop, 15 minutes, and women will speak less than 5 minutes. It was really critical for us, and several factors, explain this. First of all, the culture of patriarchy that made women feel themselves not as expert, and the problem that we have this expression that we need to perform knowledge. So, and to perform knowledge, we need to express ourselves as a man. Well, and the gender power relationship. So sometimes when there's more men than women, there will be really because of the culture, again, of the patriarchal culture that would silence a woman. So this is why we organized non-mixed deliberation workshop, because we really wanted to help to create safe space for a woman, but we wanted them to express them fully. As I said it, if we had more time, I think we'll be organizing more workshop feminists in other countries, not just in Canada. So in total, more than 611 person participate to this project, and it's important to say that when we talk about those numbers, it's really the number. It's not really our number, but more the result of the organization of all those facilitators that bring those people together. As Vincent is gonna talk about it, the project was supposed to be not supposed to happen on COVID. So we were supposed to meet all those people. We were supposed to travel around the world to help everybody organize them deliberation workshop, but because of the context, we couldn't. So I really want to say thank you to all those facilitators that because it's because of you that we have those numbers, not really because of me or because of the team. And thank you very much. If we have achieved the parity, it's again because of you, because I can say that I know that a lot of facilitators were really care about the fact that they wanted women to participate it. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Fatima. So before talking about the methodology, I'll just re-go over the context a bit. So as you know, the document we try to work on is the first international normative instrument on the ethics of AI. And so it comes from a resolution from the UNESCO's 40th General Conference that happened on November 2019. And what the process was the following. First, they formed an ad hoc expert group that Fatima talked a little bit about. It was 22 experts from everywhere in the world, and they had a very diverse specialties, ethicians, AI researchers, psychologists, sociologists, so they have a lot of diversity in their specialties. And they wrote what we call the preliminary version, or a first draft, which was a text composed of several principles and many recommendations for the member countries of UNESCO. And after they wrote this preliminary version, the idea was to have a consultation with the people of the world. And so this came in three different processes, three different chapters. One was an online public consultation that was managed by UNESCO directly. So it was a questionnaire mainly, where people could actually answer kind of a poll, and there were also memoirs. There were also some workshops that were organized. Then there were some regional and national consultations that were co-organized by host countries in different UNESCO regions, and so those were really organized by the country themselves and by the country governments. And then finally, there was this open deliberation process with multiple stakeholders and citizens. That's us. That's the open dialogue on AI ethics. That's what we're talking about today. And this was supported by the governments of Quebec and of Canada, and the different amount of our research institutions in Canada. And the idea was really to get different networks than the regional and national consultations that were organized by host countries. The idea was to get a diversity of participants and diversity of point of views from everywhere in the world. And so how did we decide to do that? We actually, I will talk a little bit more about the format, but what's important is that we decided to approach the different part of the recommendations through 6 themes. And these themes were based on 2 criteria. There was they had to be related to the key areas of the UNESCO's mandate, and also to the concerns expressed in the recommendation. And so what we did is we chose the 6 themes, we wrote scenarios about it, and then the different workshops that I'm going to talk about, every time they were about one particular theme. So one question that we would like to answer before is why were we chosen to lead this process of deliberation? And so this actually goes in continuity with our expertise on deliberation about AI ethics. So it's important to know that in 2017, the University of Montreal led this process that was called the Montreal Declaration for Responsible AI Development, where actually we organized more than 15 deliberative workshops with citizens, stakeholders, and many people. And the idea was actually to write a declaration of 10 ethical principles. So it's a kind of an ethical framework. And that was kind of unprecedented in the field of consultation on ethics of AI. And that really built an expertise. So we have an expertise regarding deliberation. We have an expertise regarding AI ethics. And the the people that led this Montreal Declaration process, there was Marc-Antoine Dillac, who's right now the lead researcher or the leader of the head of our lab, the Algora Lab, and so we have this expertise in that way. And also, it's important to know that Montreal, the city of Montreal, is a world leader in AI, in the research of AI, thanks, among others, to the research center that is Mila, the Quebec AI Institute of Artificial Intelligence. And so that gives us really the opportunity to be at the hub, at the center of this discussion. And so I think that's probably some of the reasons why we were chosen to lead this deliberation. So about the timeline, just to give a bit of context, because a lot of people told us that things were a bit crammed up, and we want to explain why, so we're going to go through the timeline. So the first contacts with UNESCO were actually in 2019. where we had the first idea, the start of the project, the definition of the project. But until May 2020, what we were actually only able to do was to start developing the guides. So when I talk about guides, I'm talking about the deliberation guide that we wrote, that was helping giving the tools to participants on how to deliberate, giving tools to participants on what is AI, what are the most important things they need to do about AI, and then about AI ethics. And so we wrote these documents mainly until May. That's the only thing we could really do, because we didn't really know what the project will look like. And as you know, also there's been a pandemic coming up, which also changed a lot of the plans. But more about that a bit later on. On the 1st of July, to 2010, we had the official confirmation from UNESCO, and we had our mandate. With the very short deadline, it had to be all done by August 17. So the way we did it is, well, we were a bit prepared, no, but we started the recruitment and the training of the facilitators on the 1st of July. And we started the deliberation workshops on July 15th. And on July 7th, it was the end of the deliberative workshops, because we had 9 days or 10 days to actually make all the analysis of all the deliberations the workshops and the delibinars, the different deliberation events that we had organized, and then write the reports and then send it to the ad hoc expert groups on the 17th. And then on the 25th, we took a bit of time to make a nice graphic design, and then we could also publish it for international for everyone to access it, pretty much. Okay. So why did we choose actually to make an international deliberation, to use this format? So in the recommendation that in the preliminary version, sorry, of the ad hoc expert group, there was this proposition 13, that said that the whole text should be written taking into consideration the specific needs of different age groups, cultural systems, persons with disabilities, women and girls, and disadvantaged, marginalized, and vulnerable populations. And so how do we do actually to try to take into consideration all these needs, all these people? If you make just a normal consultation or a poll, it's very difficult actually to do that. And so we chose the deliberation because, so the deliberation, what is it? It's actually an exchange of arguments between people in order to formulate a common decision based on differences and divergence. And when we talk based on differences, we also mean differences of experience. And so the idea, it's a very interesting process, because you get people together that have different background, different experience, and they talk about, and they need to take a common decision. Maybe they will not all agree about everything, but on this decision, they agree together. And so we think it's a very nice format for actually try to take into account different specificities of people in the population. And so on the top of that, actually, a deliberation has an epistemic value. So what it means is that it does valorize the experiences of citizens. It's kind of a collective intelligence process where if you poll people, you will just ask people what they think, but they will not have to defend it, to argue about it, and to discuss about it, to discover the experiences of other people. When you actually get into a deliberation, people, the result of it is actually usually more interesting and richer than the sum of all the individual contributions of each of them. And that's the whole idea of the epistemic value of such a process. But on top of that, you also have different other values. So you have a social value, the idea of calling on civil society to shape the future of AI, to create links between the different the individuals, the organizations, at the local level, organization at more international levels, governments, UNESCO, all this, we create these kind of links, and that's very interesting. There's also this idea of political values. So there were actually partnerships between nations on this global topic of AI. So that's happening at UNESCO, but also in the process that we were doing, there was the Canadian Commission in UNESCO, the Commission of Andorra. There was ISESCO, which was the part of the Arabic world that also is at UNESCO. And so there was partnership between different countries and different nations that was really nice. There's also human values. We build international relationships when we talk with different facilitators, when the facilitators talk with different people from everywhere in the world. That does create some human links, and that's already just per se, that's already has a very interesting value. And so how did the consultation take place? So there was two main methodologies that we followed. There was one that was the deliberative workshop and one that was a delibinar. So the picture you see currently, it's the picture of a deliberative workshop. I just want to make a small stop. Normally like in normal times, we will have had the idea to do that face-to-face in person. Because that's the way it has always been done, and also it's always easier to have human contact when you are in a room with people around the table and to talk. However, with the COVID pandemics, we had to change that, and what we did is we adapted the methodologies in online deliberation. So we really conducted a large-scale online deliberation using software like Zoom, for example, to get together people. And that had actually kind of an advantage because we didn't have to travel everywhere. We don't have to organize, to organize the rooms, organize the transportation, make sure that we weren't in one city and not, it actually somehow we didn't expect it, but it actually was really nice because we can really decentralize and have things happen in parallel a bit everywhere, and that was actually pretty good. So this being said, we had two methodologies, the deliberative workshop and the delibinar. The idea of the deliberative workshop is really a copy-paste of or an adaptation of the usual deliberative workshops that is made face-to-face. So we had small groups, 6 to 10 people, which creates kind of an intimacy. People have time to get to know each other a bit. Sometimes they have the time they dare take the time to speak and to speak to other people, and they also have to develop the arguments in a rigorous way. And what it allows us to do is to create really rich quantitative content. And that's really what we're looking for deliberative workshops. On the delibinars, it was something that was a lot larger in order to get more people, to consult more people about particular teams. We get more quantitative data, also a bit of qualitative data, but I'm going to talk a bit more afterwards in the next slide. So so pretty much the idea was more in details. The deliberative workshop, we had 6 to 10 people. It lasted like 2 hours and 45 minutes, sometimes 2 hours 30, sometimes 2 hours, but overall that was the aim, the goal. And the idea was to, so as I said, obtain qualitative data on 2 to 5 specific propositions from the recommendation. It went actually in a 5-step process. There was an introduction, everybody will get to know each other. Then there was a preparation for the deliberation. So pretty much we asked people to read a scenario that we had written that was according to a certain team. The team was chosen by the facilitators in advance. And then they had to identify the ethical issues that they will see in this scenario. And the interest of that is that, you get people to start, thinking about ethical issues, thinking about AI, and, starting to think, okay, there's things that actually we should talk about, pretty much. And then we presented them in the third step. We presented them the proposals, the recommendations of the text made by the experts, and we asked them to evaluate them. So first, evaluate them evaluate them on 3 factors: are they relevant? Are they sufficient? Are they applicable? And then on the first step was them to actually propose ways to improve them. Whether by changing them, by adding stuff, saying that this term we don't like it, it's not appropriate. This will be way better. And so by creating that, by doing that, we allow them really to participate into the redaction, pretty much, of this declaration, of this recommendation. And finally, there was the conclusion step, which was the 5th one. And so the thing is, there was only 6 to 10 people who could participate. And that's really limited the overall amount of participants, because for each workshop we have 6 to 10. If we want to reach quite a good amount of participants, that really limits. It gets very complicated to organize that many. So we proposed a second, more flexible format, which was making it more possible to mobilize a larger number of participants, between 20 and 100. So because we had only 6 to 10 participants that were able to attend the deliberative workshops, the overall amount of participants was actually limited. because it was a lot of organization for each of the workshops, and we wanted to reach around 500 to 600 participants, and that in the amount of time we had, that was a bit difficult. So we therefore proposed a second, more flexible format for deliberation, which made it possible to mobilize a larger number of participants, between 20 and 100, on a specific theme. And so we call it delibinar, which is kind of a term we invented, which is a mix between webinar and deliberation. And so once again, it had a specific theme, and it lasted 2 hours. It was a bit less long. And more importantly, it was organized on behalf of an organization. And so that's different from the deliberative workshop. The facilitators in the deliberative workshops were mostly citizens without any organizational tie. In this case, in the delibinar, it was an organization, and usually in relation with the team. So, for example, Future Earth was the Future Earth organization organized a delibinar about environment and AI. And so the objectives of the deliberative work of the delibinar, sorry, were a lot broader. But overall, so it depended actually on the case. But overall, the idea was to consult many people, increase representativity, engage discussion, and raise awareness. And so finally, what are so I presented the methodology. How did we do that consultation, that deliberation, and we actually got some interesting methodological conclusions. One of them was that it was very important to have some flexibility in the methodology. The reason for that is that different communities whose voices are rarely heard sometimes have different needs, different way of doing things, and it was really important that we were flexible in that aspect to allow them to mobilize and to actually receive their point of view and their what they can bring to the discussion. And so, for example, for the two feminist workshops that Fatima talked about a bit earlier, it was important to make it a woman-only format. For other places, for example, in Benin or in the indigenous Mi'kmaq community in Canada, we agreed that the deliberation will be made face-to-face as long as they follow the instructions of their health of the health safety authorities in their countries. For us, we agreed that it will happen face to face, even if the format was a bit different. I think it was all fine, and so we made sure that the procedures were flexible in order to be able to get what they could bring. Pretty much. And the second thing we found was important is to adapt the content of the deliberation to the target audience. And that was made with the help of the facilitators. Once again, Fatima talked a bit about it, but the idea was to, in order to enable a discussion and to understand the cultural context of the region, we needed the facilitators, and that allowed to have actually a lot more interesting discussions about topics that really were relevant to the people who are talking about it, and so it was really an important step that we made through the method, through the process. We realized, oh, we should really do that, and we allowed it to happen. So with that said, I hope the methodology is clear, and now I'm going to let Camille talk more about the results of this whole process.
Yes, thank you, Vincent. So I will be talking first about the results of our deliberative process, and then I will move to a comparative analysis of the first version and then of the second version of the recommendation. So to start with, let's look at the results. So we start here with the comments participants made regarding policy action 1. So policy actions essentially are the way that the recommendation structures its propositions. So the different elements that it suggests are organized according to themes. So in this case, we have promote diversity and inclusion. This is policy action 1. Policy action 1 is promote diversity and inclusion. So with regards to this theme, this category within the recommendation, we saw that participants found it important to fight against AI systems reflecting existing inequalities. So of course, around the world, we see inequalities around race, around gender, around abilities. And so participants really insisted that, of course, AI systems should not continue to reflect these. Also, participants mentioned that it was not enough for the inequalities to not be reflected in the development of AI systems, but also in their implementation. So when they are introduced into our daily lives, it's important that they don't have discriminatory effects. With regards to this, participants mentioned that an intersectional analysis was needed to address these issues. So intersectional in the sense of taking the lens of different identities, or for instance, gender, race, geographical identities are important, but also intersectional in the sense of relating to technical expertise, relating to ethical or philosophical expertise, relating to, for instance, anthropological expertise. Those are all lenses that are valuable, and they're all needed to make sure that AI systems are designed and implemented in ways that are ethical and responsible and don't perpetuate discrimination. Now, participants also mentioned that we needed more inclusive AI teams, so AI teams that allowed for more people of different identities to participate. But of course, this is not enough. It was mentioned also that, of course, this call for inclusiveness should not only be a marketing strategy or some kind of superficial initiative. This needs to be a structural, a paradigm shift in the way that our AI teams are composed, and essentially in the way that they create and design AI. Now, generally, with regards to promoting diversity and inclusion, participants mentioned that the proposals within this theme were relevant. However, they were not specific enough, and the terminology they used was too weak. Now, if we look at policy actions 2 and 3, so policy action 2 was regarding the labor market. So with regards to the propositions within this theme, we saw that participants highlighted how automation due to AI will have a significant impact on the employment market, and underlined the importance of having opportunities to reinforce one's skills, to requalify or to upskill. So this was really important in making sure that individuals can keep participating in a meaningful way in the labor market. Participants also highlighted that marginalized peoples, including women, will be the ones most affected by automation and subsequent job loss. Now, in terms of policy action number 3, which concerned economic and social repercussions, participants highlighted the digital divide. So these are essentially inequalities in access to connectivity, so for instance, internet connection, and AI-related infrastructure. So participants thought this was important to address, but they also believed that it was not properly treated by policy action 3. Participants also mentioned that the certification of AI systems was generally a good idea. However, Proposition 57 lacked specificity and also included a reference to the certification of medical devices, and that was considered to not be especially relevant in this case. Now, looking to policy action 4, which included both culture and environment as its main themes. So in terms of culture, participants highlighted that there were concerns around the unequal treatment of languages, and that this was not particularly well addressed by the recommendation. And so these languages that we sometimes call minority languages, they also include indigenous languages, are often left out of AI. So we see a lot of AI work and AI implementations happening centered around English, for instance. And so this, of course, leaves out a number of other languages. Now, with regards to the environment, participants thought it was crucial that the public be better informed about the environmental impacts of AI and of technology more generally. Additionally, the recommendation offered only one proposal regarding the environment. However, participants thought there should be at least two. So one addressing the negative environmental impacts of AI, and another proposition that addressed the applications of AI that were that could be able to help fight climate change. Now, even when AI is used in a way that is that is intended to help mitigate climate change, it is done so in a way that is still colonial. And so that was also a problem highlighted by participants. Now, looking at policy actions 5 and 6, those regarded education. So we saw that participants really had a general awareness of the impacts, the risks, but also the opportunities that present themselves in the context of AI and education. One of the risks they highlighted was meaningful consent in using AI in education. So, of course, when we think of education, we think of children, we think of individuals who are minors in the eyes of the law. Now, it's important to find a way to have meaningful consent happen for minors in the context of AI being used, for instance, in the classrooms. So that was an important challenge for participants. Now, there were also some other concerns regarding the use of AI in education. So to address these, participants suggested, for instance, that student data should be erased by default when they reach the age of majority, for instance. So this would help stop potential misuse of their data. Now, participants also mentioned the very important emotional and social aspects of the teacher-student relationship in education and the impacts that AI in education could have on this relationship. Now, there were also concerns around the fact that AI in education could increase inequalities among students. If we look now to policy actions 7 and 8, those concern the international cooperation and development. So we saw from countries in the global south that there was really an importance of having international cooperation that would help reduce inequalities between countries concerning AI development. So we saw that many countries in the south face challenges that both complicate the development of AI, but also complicate the applicability of ethical standards. And so in light of this, there's clearly a need to contextualize standards with regards to social, political, economic situations in specific countries. So no solution will be a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to personalize, we need to adapt. Now, the recommendation, according to participants, should also recognize the power relations and the structural inequalities between nations and industry. So we can think of, for instance, the classic big tech companies. So participants believe this should be highlighted. Also, the recommendation should highlight that these inequalities are the result of historical injustices. And so this is important to take into account so that international cooperation isn't just some kind of a publicity stunt or something that makes a certain country look good. So we want concrete action and concrete results in reducing inequalities. Now, if we look to policy actions 9 and 10, so with policy action 9, we have governance. So on the theme of governance, participants had some comments around the UNESCO's consultation process. They highlighted that they were essentially responding to a document that had already been developed in a structure that was already pre-established. And so this impeded any kind of co-development between citizen populations and experts at, that were affiliated with UNESCO. Now, in terms of inclusion and diversity, this is something that is clearly very important within the recommendation, but some participants felt that the way it was being portrayed was essentially tokenizing, so that they were being consulted only to check a box and not really so that their feedback would be implemented in a meaningful way. Now, also with regards to governance, many participants mentioned that third-party organizations would be good candidates to perform AI governance and the evaluation of AI systems. So some participants mentioned, for instance, UNESCO and the United Nations as potential candidates. Now, participants also stressed the need to have a reliable and fair process to challenge any results that an AI system may give. And so this is important because in the context where an AI system makes a decision, so decides, for instance, if someone is eligible for a bank loan, it's important for individuals to first be able to understand why this decision was made, and to, of course, appeal it if they think it is incorrect or discriminatory. So the need for mechanisms that allow for these challenges was really important for participants and was not reflected in the recommendation. Now, if we look to policy action 10, which was regarding trustworthy AI, we saw that explainability was a central concept. So the ability for someone to explain why a certain AI system reached a certain result or made a certain decision. So this, in a nutshell, is explainability. However, participants thought that this was not enough, and they wanted to go further. And so one participant mentioned the notion of understandability. So the difference here is that if we only go by explainability, then the explanation is given in a way that does not take into account the needs of the person receiving the explanation. So for instance, if someone was explaining to me why an AI system declined my demand for a bank loan, well, this person would have to, first of all, speak to me either in English or in French, as I do not speak any other languages. It is also important that the explanation that this person gives me is adapted to my level of knowledge regarding AI systems. So an extremely technical and very math-heavy explanation would not contribute to any kind of clarity for me around the way that the AI system reached its decision. So understandability essentially aims for AI explainability to take into account the needs of the persons receiving explanations. So if we look also at trustworthy AI, we saw that participants essentially put trust in humans when they did have trust, and not in AI systems themselves. Also, participants highlighted risks surrounding having too much transparency around AI systems. So some transparency, of course, is seen as being positive, but too much might leave AI systems and organizations that use them open to attacks, or that could have very dramatic effects. And so one solution that was proposed was to perhaps have different levels of transparency for different groups of people. So the public could have access to a certain amount of information, and then, for instance, governments could have access to other kinds of information or more information or different details. And so to have this really, this very targeted approach towards how much transparency is given was seen as a potential solution by participants. And looking at policy action 11, which encompassed responsibility, accountability, and privacy, we see that, first of all, participants believe that information about AI systems should be communicated to the public in ways that are appropriate for experts, and then in ways that are appropriate for lay people. It was important to avoid the black box, so to have essentially the effect of having an AI system that nobody can really explain why they got to a certain decision. Information about the environmental impact of AI was also something important to be communicated. And information regarding complaints and redresses was also something participants wanted to see in the recommendation. Now, it was clear also for participants that responsibility, just like trust, should not be attributed to AI systems, but really to human beings. Although I should mention, there was some disagreement with regards to that. Now, if we look at privacy, participants generally wanted a tougher proposition in terms of privacy. The proposition that was present in the recommendation used the term encourage. So member states should encourage XYZ. And so this term was seen as really inadequate. We want something stronger to really push member states to enforce adequate privacy. Now, we also saw that participants wanted serious consequences for companies that infringe the right to privacy. So consequences that will truly act as deterrence and not only the proverbial slap on the wrist. And so in addition to this, it was also important for participants that human rights beyond the right to privacy be recognized in the recommendation, as well as historical and systemic inequalities that should also be recognized. And lastly, it was important for participants that the sovereignty they have, or sorry, let me reformulate this. So it was important for participants that they gain sovereignty and control, meaningful control over their data. Now, if we look at other contributions that were made by participants, but that did not fit in any of the specific policy actions, we see the general theme of information and communication. So this is something that was generally quite absent from the recommendation. And so participants wanted the recommendation to include propositions regarding personalizing content and how it might be advantages, but how it can also have some major negative impacts in how individuals access information. There was also a need for information around increasing disinformation in the recommendation. And also, it was stated that the recommendation should condemn political manipulation through AI, as well as acknowledge the impact of AI on journalism. Now, if we look at techno-solutionism, participants were quite critical of this. So here we really found that some participants thought that the recommendation was too optimistic about AI, about its promises, and so essentially fell into techno-solutionism. So this is the idea that technology can solve all of our problems, when of course this isn't true. It was also noticed that indigenous knowledges, in contrast with the more colonial logic of optimization and rationalization, we're always kind of left in the shadow of this colonial logic. So it was important to bring these knowledges and perspectives forward. Now, lastly, it was important in this perspective to not only have ethical design and inclusion and notions of, for instance, privacy by design, but also it's crucial to really look into how technology changes our relations with the world. So now we will be taking a look at the comparative analysis between the first version and the second version of the recommendation. So I'll just begin by explaining the difference between the two. The first version is the one I was referring to in my previous presentation. It's the version that all the participants discussed. Now, we, as Vincent mentioned earlier, we sent out a report to UNESCO on the 17th of August, and this report included the results from our consultations. Now, UNESCO also had other consultations happening from which they received further input, but essentially from this input, they put out a second version on September 7th. So now what I will do is essentially analyze the similarities, the differences between the first and the second version of the recommendation. So to begin with, we saw that in the second version, the notion of AI actors was much better defined than in the first one. This was a comment that came back again and again during consultations, where participants really weren't quite sure who the recommendation was referring to when it referred to AI actors. So we see in the second version that we've included examples such as researchers, programmers, engineers, large technology companies, startups, universities. So all these actors are included, and the definition is thus a lot more clear. Now, if we look at some more general comments, we see also that the AI lifecycle is much more present in the document. So what does that mean? Is that throughout the recommendation, there's a much more consistent recognition of the ethical issues that might arise throughout the entire AI lifecycle. So not only, for instance, at the stage of development, or not only at the stage of implementation, but at the complete array of stages that can happen. Now, we also noticed that the second version was more clearly organized. So just in terms of the very broad structure of the document, and you'll notice that as I go through the analysis of the comparative analysis. Now, we also saw that there was this mention of a duty of solidarity. So this duty is from countries who have more resources, more infrastructures in AI, towards countries who have less resources and infrastructures for AI. And so we see here that there's really a need to, there's really a recognition of the geographic disparities and the power dynamics that exist around the world in relation to AI. We also notice a new general remark around the fact that the recommendation will be implemented in a way that reflects the different stages of readiness of the different countries. So these stages of readiness are related to the scientific, the technological, the economic, educational. All these dimensions are going to affect how the recommendation is implemented. So now looking at values and principles, we saw that in the second version, trustworthiness became essentially a value. So it moved from, in the first version, being a policy action to now being a value that should be encompassed in essentially every proposition, every policy action in the second version. Now, additionally, we saw a shift from a more anthropocentric perspective to a more ecocentric perspective. So what does this mean? What does this mean in practice? Is that now ecosystems and the environment are much more recognized throughout the recommendation, and the ethical issues that pertain to the environment and to ecosystems are much better represented throughout the recommendation. So we have here only a select example. So we see that we've added a reference to ecosystems, but this trend really shows itself throughout the entire document. So the shift is essentially quite important. We also saw that in the first version, we had two separate groups of principles, but we highlighted how this division did not really add to the clarity of the document, and so this was removed from the second version, and now we only have a single group of principles. We also saw a modification in the principle of proportionality, or at least in a part of it. So in the first version, the principle of proportionality stated that the chosen AI method or AI system should not have an excessive infringement on the values presented in the recommendation. So these values include things like human rights and freedoms. It also includes the respect of the environment and of ecosystems. So just to name these two. And the issue that participants saw is that by qualifying the infringements with the word excessive, this really left a lot of room for it left a lot of leeway for important violations of things like human rights, of things like environments and ecosystems. And so participants wanted to see this changed, and we saw in the second version that now the principle of proportionality states that the chosen AI method should not infringe on the values proposed in the document. And so our team sees this as a positive change. Now, we also saw the addition of the word and essentially the concept of understandability to what was already being described in terms of explainability. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, understandability takes into account the needs and the position of the person receiving an explanation with regards to AI systems. And so we also saw this as quite a positive addition to the second version of the recommendation. Now, with regards to policy area number 1. So policy areas are essentially the new policy actions. So in the first draft, in the first version of the recommendation, the themes, the categories throughout the recommendation were called policy actions. In the second version, they're now called policy areas. And their ordering has also changed quite a bit. So policy area number 1 is ethical impact assessment. So we saw in the first version, for instance, once again, the use of the word encouraged, which was criticized by participants. So proposition number 95 stated that member states are encouraged to introduce impact assessments. Now we see in the second version, so what was proposition number 95 became proposition number 50, and now it says that member states should introduce impact assessments to identify, etc. And so we see this change as from going from the term encouraged, which was criticized, to a term that is somewhat stronger. So we've moved to should. We also see a new recognition of the rights of vulnerable groups, as well as labor rights. And so we see these additions as being positive, and we also see, of course, the addition of the environment and the ecosystems that should be recognized and addressed in the impact assessments. Now, if we continue to look at policy area number 1, we also see that in Proposition 51, there's a new mention of the impact of AI on poverty, as well as the gap between the rich and the poor. And we see the addition of the digital divide. So propositions concerning the digital divide, not only between countries, but within countries. So now with regards to policy area number 2, we have ethical governance and stewardship. So with regards to this theme, in the first version at Proposition 97, we had the sentence, including by encouraging private sector companies to provide remediation mechanisms. And so this sentence was criticized by participants, as they highlighted that states, for instance, also implement AI systems. And so this should not only be restricted to private sector companies. Now we see in the second version that the proposition got somewhat stronger with regards to, for instance, human rights and the rule of law. However, we still see this mention of private sector companies. So there's less of a change in this case. Now, if we keep going with policy area number 2, we see that the comparison with the certification of medical devices was removed. And we also see recognition of, for instance, anti-democratic ideas. So this was something that was not mentioned in the first version of the recommendation, and that participants wanted to see mentioned. So anti-democratic ideas, the spreading of non-reliable information. So these are all issues that are related to access to information and communication. And so we were quite happy to see participants' comments reflected in the second version. Now, if we also look at Proposition 69, we see that in the second version, this proposition calls for member states to enhance the power of their judiciary systems to make decisions related to AI systems. And so this is important as a challenge we often see regarding AI guidelines or frameworks, is that they constantly remain non-legally binding. And so in this case, we were happy to see that the proposition moves member states forward along the line and asks them to really reinforce the power of their judiciary systems with regards to AI systems. Now, if we look at policy area number 3, which is data policy, and then policy area number 4, which is development and international cooperation. So starting with policy area number 3, we see that there is now the recognition that individuals should retain the rights over their personal data. So we see here the reflection of the desire for sovereignty over one's data that was expressed by participants. And in policy area 4, we see that there is a recognition of this, these contextual differences that were very important to participants. So Proposition 83 now mentions that there should be research into the applicability of specific ethical frameworks in specific cultures and contexts, and that essentially these possibilities should match the frameworks to technologically feasible solutions. And so we really see here reflected this need for to recognize that a solution will not be a one-size-fits-all, and that it should be tailored to each context. Now looking at policy areas 5 and 6, So policy area 5 is environment and ecosystems. And with regards to this, we also saw the addition of local and indigenous communities that should be involved in AI systems and in their deployment, for instance. And this should be the case throughout the life cycle of the AI system. And AI should also support circular economy, as well as sustainable consumption and production patterns. And so we see here really a broadening of the issues that are discussed in the context of environment and ecosystems and AI. So the position of environment within the recommendation has gotten much wider. And we can see this as being at least partly in response to the comments provided by participants. Now looking at policy area 6, which touches upon the idea of the issues around gender, we see first of all that now propositions that are related to gender equality and diversity have their own section, as opposed to the first version where they did not. Now we also see that in the second version, there's a recognition of gender identities and not just women. So we see essentially the recognition of more than 2 genders. Now we also see that there's a discussion of the specific inequalities that AI should not exacerbate in relation to gender. So in the sense, the recommendation got a lot more specific with regards to this, and participants had commented on the lack of general lack of specificity in the first draft of the recommendation. Now, if we look at policy area number 7, which touches upon culture, so that also includes languages. So we see a change in terminology. We've moved from rare languages to endangered languages. And we also note a new proposition, Proposition 99, which recognizes the need to promote a diverse supply and plural access to cultural expressions, as well as the visibility of local content. And so this is once again related to the idea of communication and access to information. And so we see these additions as something positive and something that reflects the comments that were made by participants regarding the lack of propositions on information and communication. Now, if we look at policy area number 8, which touches upon education and research, we see, first of all, that the prerequisite skills that were presented in the first version of the recommendation were significantly expanded. So the prerequisite skills needed for AI and AI education in the first version were quite limited to literacy, numeracy, coding skills, for instance, but now we've added a much broader array of skills that go beyond this perhaps quite technical approach. And so we see media and information literacy, we see critical thinking, socio-emotional skills, AI ethics skills. So these are all very crucial, and we think will help build AI teams that are more diverse, more inclusive, and ultimately build more responsible and ethical AI systems. Now, if we also look at Proposition 105, we notice now that with regards to education, there's a recognition of the emotional and social aspects that are tied to it, and specifically of the teacher-student and student-student relationships that are essential to education. So if you remember a little earlier, I highlighted comments made by participants that were exactly in the sense that education was more than simply, we can frame it as information. Education is also those relationships we build. And so this, we are happy to see, was reflected in the second version of the recommendation. Now, looking at policy area number 9, which touches upon economy and labor. We see that now the unequal power dynamics between certain countries and big technology companies is addressed. So we see more specifically a recognition of the risk of exploitation of certain countries by large technology companies. And so we saw this as quite an addition in the second version, and we noticed that exploitation is really, the use of the term exploitation is really making a strong stance within the recommendation. And looking at policy area 10, the final policy area in the second version, this one has to do with health and social well-being. So this is a new section, and it has a number of new propositions that concern human and robot interactions. So this was not part of the first version of the recommendation. And we also see new propositions that regard information and communication, journalism, disinformation, as well as hate speech. And so these are all themes that participants during our consultation thought it was crucial to add to the recommendation. And as we see here, their voices were heard, or at least the voices that shine throughout the different consultation processes of UNESCO affected the second version of the recommendation. And we now see issues regarding information and communication being much more broadly reflected. And so now looking forward, the next steps with this recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence will first of all receive comments from member states. So the second version, the member states will comment on and hand in their comments to UNESCO by December 31st, 2020. And then essentially member states will vote on the recommendation before the end of 2021. And so there's still quite a lot of time left before we see the final results or the final effects of the recommendation, but we look forward to keeping up with these changes and the progress of the recommendation.
Thank you very much, Camille, for this presentation. So before we finish, I will just say thank you to all her partners and sponsorships. So I'm thanking for Government of Quebec and Government of Canada, but also Mila, University of Montreal, IVADO, MIE, MICE, Foundation of Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, Future Earth, l'Observatoire sur les impacts sociétaux de l'IA et du numérique, and of course CIFAR. And sorry, UNESCO, we hope that you liked our presentation. And if you need more information, just all the information will be on the description of the video. Her website, you will find the original document of that we furnished to her facilitator, and even the report in French and in English.